Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 18th Democracy Talk. This is our first for the month, and it will continue to be one a month from now on. And to get started, I wanted to introduce our guest today, Dino Siwek. He's the co-founder of the project Terra Adentro and a member of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective. He'll speak on the topic navigating complexity, depth education, and politics beyond polarization. And so I'll just hand it over to Dino to introduce himself a bit more.
Thanks, Vanina. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Dino Siwek. I'm joining you today on behalf of Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures Collective. And I'll start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from what is known today as São Paulo, Brazil, on the invaded and ceded lands of the Guarani indigenous people. And I do this acknowledgement to honor both their ancestrality and their present struggles to have their ways of being and their territory respected. I also want to honor their relationship of custodianship with the land, as well as that of other indigenous peoples in this country. Recognizing that these relationships, they do play an immense role in maintaining the planet as a livable place for all beings, and that include us, whether we like it or not. I think an important part of GTDF's work is informed by indigenous analysis of colonization and colonialism, particularly from a network of indigenous communities that is called the Teia das Cinco Curas, with whom we have been engaging for the past 9 years. So for them and for us, a central issue of colonization and the crisis that we are collectively experiencing is the notion of separability. So the separation of humans from the land, from each other, and from other beings, which ultimately leads to the subjugation of people and the dispossession of land. And I'll expand on this analysis soon, but I wanted to do this acknowledgement, and I think what I'll do next is to share my screen and guide us to our presentation today. Okay, so let me know if you can all see. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so what I'll do today is to first briefly introduce GTDF's work, explore how we understand the context of the crisis we face today, and share some of our pedagogical experiments. And I think one thing that is important to say is that these experiments, they do not just seek to provide ready-made solutions, but what they try to do is to cultivate capacity to sit with complexity, contradiction, and difficult realities. So what we try to do is to try to move conversations between common places where they tend to get stuck, especially within context of intense polarization. So a little bit about GTDF. It's a transdisciplinary, multi-generational collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and indigenous and Afro-descendant knowledge keepers. Our work is at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence, and questions related to the unsustainability of current modern colonial systems. We try to bring together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, economic instability, wealth disparity, global mental health crisis, climate and biodiversity catastrophes, and the intensification of social and ecological violence and inequalities. So I think one important aspect of our analysis is that modernity is built on and it continues to be sustained in what we call layers of illusions or denials. And they include the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm. So the fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation. Sometimes it's really close to us, sometimes it's really far away, but this seems to be a logic that persists in these relationships. The denials of the limits of the planet, So the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption indefinitely, the denial of entanglement, our insistence on seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land, rather than entangled in this Earth, this living planet that we call a living wider metabolism, and the denial of the magnitude and the complexity of the challenge we need to face together. So this tendency to look for simplistic solutions that makes us feel good and look good, and that may address symptoms, but they do not get to the root cause of our collective, what we call hyper complex, wicked predicaments. And I'll get into that soon. So, because what I think it's important is that these denials, they kind of like, they keep us locked in these patterns of avoidance. And it makes it difficult to engage with this just challenge of our time that we are calling wicked challenge, because these are problems that are like hyper complex, multi-layered and interlocked. And that means that when you try to create a solution somewhere, this can generate a problem elsewhere. And they seem to resist resolution through traditional problem solving methods, and they require sort of like ongoing adaptive engagements. And what tends to happen when we reproduce the cycle of simplistic solutions is to go in this merry-go-round, where we try to have like feel-good interventions, transactional engagements, and creates a narrow imagination of what's possible that again generates safe and simplistic solutions. So what we understand is that addressing these wicked problems require moving beyond these cycles and developing a sort of stamina to engage with complexity in a more responsible way. So that's why within GTDF, what we try to explore is a pedagogy that we call depth education. And I think the best way to explain what we're trying to do is to differentiate it from a more conventional form of education that we could call master education. And I think one way to see this distinction is using this image, these metaphors of a cup and an onion. So in master education, learning and the learner are imagined as cups that needs to be filled with knowledge, with skills, and some sort of solutions. So there is a focus, there is on accumulation, on efficiency, and especially on the ability to produce results. And in depth education, on the other hand, we are thinking about like an onion that we are trying to peel and see what comes next. So it's about unlearning, deconstructing assumptions, and expanding like this capacity to sit with the complexity of these problems. Because as you remove a layer, you can have new insights, but it will also bring more questions, more discomfort, and hopefully more humility as well. So the idea is not to provide quick answers, but to expand our ability to hold multiple perspectives and contradictions at the same time. So I would say that in a way, that education tries to cultivate a few capacities, such as hold discomfort and contradictions without rushing to resolutions, try to see how we are part of the problem, not just the solution, not just trying to be on this imagined side of the people that have the solutions. Try to develop stamina for navigating difficult and unresolved questions. And you see that like this idea of developing stamina, it's quite important in the work that we do. And also try to move beyond personal feelings that can come around, like it could even be guilt or also righteousness towards sort of like what kind of responsibilities we should have. And I think within these frameworks, there are a few questions we can ask. So these are just examples of the kind of questions that we ask within depth education. So how do we prepare ourselves to tackle the challenges of our times, including unprecedented complex dilemmas and also disasters of our own making that we will have to face together? So it's not about what are our solutions, but what kind of work do we have to do to be prepared to face the consequence of our actions? And how can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing at the same time to each other and to the land at all times, especially in times of crisis and polarization? And finally, how can we learn to choose sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability in a culture of late modernity that often promotes and rewards the opposite? So one of the ways you can see depth education more in practice is through what we call technologies of inquiry. And these are pedagogical experiments that invite us to approach the issue as a collaborative inquiry. So to suspend the impulse to solve and to fix, to collectively engage with the issue, seeking to identify multiple angles, layers, interconnections, and hotspots, to embrace ambiguity, uncertainty, paradox, and contradictions, and to identify and collaboratively articulate questions that are worth holding collectively. And this is different from asserting or seeking validation for one's opinion, fixing or solving a problem, offering advice, or seeking consensus. And I'll briefly show you some of those tools, and we'll see how we go with time and see if we have time to engage with them all. So I think there is a key exercise on GTDF, which is what we call the buzz within us. And this is like an exercise of imagination, and we invite people to imagine this buzz. And we are this buzz, and we are filled with different passengers within ourselves. And each passenger can represent something different from ourselves and our affective states. Sometimes it's like competing desires that we have, sometimes fear, sometimes conditioned responses. And usually how we will work with this bus is to offer a prompt, reflexive questions, and then participants will look into themselves and draw their own buses and try to explore the reactions of these different passengers. Sometimes it's a passenger that is sitting on the front of the bus or even driving the bus, and that means that we know this passenger quite well. Sometimes it's a passenger that is on the back, and we sometimes get surprised with the fact that this passenger even exists. And there is also like different prompts that we use. So for example, you can get each of these passengers and say like what he's saying, what she's thinking, and what she's feeling. And this can all also be different. And what we are trying to do here is to sort of like recognize internal tensions that shape our engagement with realities and with particularly complex realities. And the thing is, if we are not able to sit with the complexity and the contradictions that we have within us, it will be much harder to sit like with the contradictions we see outside in the world. And this is particularly useful when we think of a context of solid and liquid modernity operating simultaneously. And now I'll get to that shortly. But I just want to, as we're not doing the practice now because we don't have the time, I'll try to invite you to, from this moment now, observe and reflect in this presentation and our time together, trying to start layering and seeing if you have these different passengers within yourself. So before getting into our next technology of inquiry, it's important to bring like these elements of that Bauman described as solid and liquid modernity. So understanding that modernity has these two forms nowadays. So while there is this solid modernity that creates rigid institutions, laws, and bureaucracies that try to offer stability and control, there is also liquid modernity that is kind of like working on the dissolution of these structures. And there is constant change and precarity and fluidity of both information and identity. And this is not a linear shift, but it's like they are both existing simultaneously, even though if we think about like this water of liquid modernity, it is constantly dissolving the certainties of solid modernity. The problem is that this tension produce polarized response. So there is even this kind of desire to cling to solid structures, demanding more control, certainty, and authority. And we are seeing that being expressed a lot in current times. But there is also, on the other side, this idea of embracing this liquid flux and rejecting institutions entirely, seeking sort of like a radical personal autonomy that has a lot of to do with like hyper individualism. And neither of these extremes, they allow us to navigate complexity responsibly the way we are trying to do. So what we try to find is a way to move in between this while holding their paradox and their issues, and not trying to fell into the temptation of seeking comfort in one side or the other. So I think we use this image because there is like this challenge of having these many layers, feeling like these many layers of systemic, historical, intergenerational, and personal pressure on our backs, and trying to stabilize ourselves within unstable certainties. And one of the things that we are trying to learn how to do is how to move it from our back and learn how to hold it collectively as a way to start, I don't know, maybe trying to undo these cycles of harm, frustration, and mistrust. The third technology that I want to show you, and I think this one is quite essential because it's sort of like a compass that we try to follow, and we call it both collaboratively inquiry, but it's also a set of orienting directions, because it's really hard to learn how to navigate within such unstable circumstances. So we created like this acronym, SMDR, which stands for the emotional sobriety, to disinvest from harmful desires and compulsions, sort of relational maturity that helps us cultivate trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability. Intellectual discernment to sort of like avoid simplistic conclusions and getting trapped in binaries and not feel overwhelmed or immobilized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And there is like this also intergenerational responsibility. So recognizing that the impacts of our own choices on the next generations and the kind of frustrations that we are producing because of the way we are dealing with our current systems. And I think I don't know how we are in time, but I want to show just a final image, which is like this image of this tightrope to illustrate a sort of a delicate balance um, that there is in between this falling into desperate hope, which can lead to reliance on saviors, ideologies, or simplistic solutions, or in the other side, reckless hopelessness, which can result in cynicism, nihilism, detachment um, from reality, and even like the sort of banalization of brutality. So I use this image because how can we navigate with both like intellectual and relational rigor, but also bringing honesty, humility, humor, and hyper self reflexivity. And I know we'll have a moment of questions and answers, but I wanted to finish just leaving a couple of questions that we can sit in the next few days. That I don't think we need to address them now. But one of the questions that I had myself as I was preparing for this conversation is how can we cultivate a governance and decision-making practice that prioritize the sort of relational accountability and ecological and intergenerational responsibility over control and certainty, and how can we individually and collectively strengthen our ability to walk this tightrope, so balancing between this desperate hope and reckless hopelessness. So I thank you for opening up this space. I just want to leave some resources here. So if you wanted to look further into our work, so there is Hospice in Modernity book, that was a book written by Professor Vanessa Andreotti, who is one of the co-founders of the collective. We have within University of Victoria, in what's known as Victoria, Canada, an online 6-week course where we try to explore deeply this called Face Human Wrongs, and a few other texts and resources that might be useful. I'm not sure if you are sharing the presentation with those that are here on the call, but you can also reach me directly and ask for it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dino. I will share the resources at the end in a post on the Agora so that everyone here and anyone else in the Democrat Project can access it there. Yeah, thank you very much. A very insightful presentation, and I think something different from what we've heard from before in democracy talks in the past. So I wanted to open the floor up to questions. If everyone doesn't mind, I'll ask one first, and then whoever else is interested, you can raise your hand or just let me know. So the first question I wanted to ask is that you highlight this challenge of oversaturation of unprocessed emotions and reactive polarization in politicals and also in educational spaces. So I'm wondering if you could expand on what strategies you found effective in fostering emotional sobriety and maturity among students and educators, particularly in societies that are often quite divided.
Yeah, thanks for this question, Vanina. I think it's a hard question because, as you mentioned, there is like this kind of like overloaded emotional circuit. So there is a lot of fear, resentments, and guilt and defensiveness. And I think our job as educator is to try to create the sort of container and spaces where we can have these conversations with these emotions. And also like there is some sort of learnings on how do we learn to self-regulate ourselves as well, and how do you learn to see what triggers us. So I think, for example, I was talking about the buzz exercise, and this is the sort of exercise that invites, in a way, the possibility of rage within a room. So because this is like a passenger, and we sometimes ask people, say, okay, if there is something, one of the rounds that we do when we're using the bus, for example, we ask people, how is your bus reacting to what's happening here? Is it okay? Is it processing, or is it burning? And if it's burning, is there something that you need to say? And then we ask participants, are you all able to hold together what needs to be said? And there's a lot of rage and a lot of emotions that comes in this moment. But I think people both had the structure to understand that they said yes to that, and they also understand that this is a passenger, and this passenger needs to speak, and it's not about like the whole self in a way, and it's something that is passing through them. Sometimes it's something that represents a collective feeling, and I think like this is one of the tools, but we need the affective and the relational presence in education, because if we're working only with the cognitive, then there will be like more and more saturation and rage and process the emotions.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I think it's quite helpful to understand a bit better. I wanted to see if there's anyone else who would like to ask a question. Diana, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, Dino, for your presentation. And while you presented also the tools you use in order to foster this type of depth education you presented, I must say it really reminds me very much on psychological tools, you know, in order to reflect on your inner self and to understand that we have different aspects that are living inside of us, and to listen to them and to give them space and not to suppressing everything. And so in my understanding, this would mean that these kind of aspects need to be integrated in the education system for children in the end, that they learn how to give every part of themselves space to reflect on this, and then in the next step, really to reflect on the behavior in a right way. So yeah, I don't know, maybe you want to say something on this, you know?
Yeah, I think you're right on like this sort of understanding of like psychological dynamics, but something that we also want to bring forward is that there is a lot of learning that we have with indigenous communities. There is connected with a sort of psychodynamics. There is in relationship with the land as well. So we also try to pay attention that it doesn't feel there is only like the self and the individual, but rather how this is connected. So using again the bus, that there are exercises where we have other layers of the bus, because we're talking about the layer of the self, but we're also talking about the layer of us collectively, of the what we call you and me, which is the sort of like the places where there is a lot of identity sharing in between people. So we try to explore that using like this principle of this factuality of entanglement. So this non-separation is really crucial to the work that we do, because I mean, if we see how we operate in the world, even in our bodies, we are not only ourselves, but we are full of bacteria and other beings that needs to be in coordination so existence can be. And yes, I think it's super important to think that on children education as well, especially because it seems that we are living a much worse world than the one we received, especially when we're talking about like climate justice crisis and all of this interlocking crisis. So I think this is like an important question. How will kids have the structures and the tools they need to face a world in collapse? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, I think I'm next. So thank you for your talk. I have two questions. The first one is, if I got it correctly, that on the one hand, you were speaking about what you called conventional forms of education and somehow different to your approach of that education. And related to the first one, the conventional form of education, you said, okay, this kind of education is looking for example, the production of results. And my first question is, I agree, but I also think that we need results, particularly in regard to leaving these cultures of denial you mentioned. So are these two kinds of educational types, let's say, really contradictory, or are they more complementary? That's my first question. The second one relates to the issue of control and certainty. And I have to add maybe that I'm coming from extremism research, particularly the far right. And one thing we have learned, I would say, is that at least a certain a share of people who are supporting racism, etc., they do so because they think they are not in control of their lives anymore in regard to the threat of migration, at least perceived as a threat of crime, but also, and maybe at least equally important, the issue of insecurity or insecurity in regard to social security, income, job, etc. So isn't there at the same time some kind of legitimate wish to control one's own life? And related to that, the question, okay, who are in a position to control other people's life? So I think it's a very complex issue, but at least these two issues I would like to address. Thank you.
Mhm. Thanks, Fabian. These are really good questions. Thanks for putting them out. I think one of the questions of like questioning results and what master education do is that it sees that the crisis that we are facing, in a way, are crises that can be solved with more knowledge and more information and more of the sort of like same structures that are actually producing the crisis that we are living. So what we can see, for example, is that those that are leading us, those that have the power to decide where we should go next, usually are people highly well educated in the universities that we are praising the most. So what we are trying to do is to bring an approach that we understand that we are not facing an informational problem. We know what we need to know to solve the problems that we have. What we have in our perspective, and of course this is just one perspective, is that we have deeply affective and relational issues that we are conditioned by these desires of modernity, of comfort, of privilege, of security. And we need to find a way to give up of all of that in order for something else to emerge. So there is like a metaphor that we use, and that's why, for example, Vanessa's book is called Hospicing Modernity, because maybe there is no way to fix the current system that we are living. And one of the movements that we can do is to hospice it in a way that its walls do not fall brutally in the same people that usually they fall. So how do we offer palliative care to that in order for something else to emerge that we don't know if it's going to be wiser? And that's also a challenge, and I think I'll connect that with your second questions about extremism and the desire to have control and certainty. And I think, yes, they are legit. And I think they are also the problem, because people are seeing that they cannot have control in such states of the world. So what we're trying to do is not to delegitimize this sort of feelings, but rather saying it's really hard to find control in the current system that we're living. The sort of idea of stability that we had in solid modernity is not present anymore. So how do we learn to navigate through this instability? And how do we learn to navigate without social security, without access to health issues, with like an education that is being contested like throughout the world, So that's the challenge. It's not saying that you shouldn't have this feeling, but rather that apparently this is not accessible anymore within this understanding of what is modernity. I'm not sure if I answered.
Okay, thank you. I think you just use, if I got it, the privilege of security. And I probably would answer, isn't this a particular privileged perspective from the global north? And there are hundreds of millions of people who would be happy to have some kind of security, even if
Mhm,
it's following this idea of, give me a second, solid modernity.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
So
Yeah, we
just some
mhm.
thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We do use a metaphor that I didn't bring today about like this house of modernity. There is crumbling, but there is this idea within this house of a sort of a ladder of social mobility, where in the top there is those that are like the north of the global north, because we don't assume that like in the global north everyone is in a good situation, but there is like this illusion that everyone could climb this ladder and that the planet will be enough for everyone to climb this ladder. So there is the sense of this promise has been broken of the social ladder. It's not accessible to all within the limits of the planet that we have.
Does anyone else have other questions for Dino? No? Okay. I think I'll ask one more if that's okay.
Of course.
Um, so I wanted to know a little bit more about intergenerational responsibility, especially since we
Hmm.
live in a world where younger generations are often disillusioned with existing institutions and governance structures. At least I know
Hmm.
I am. And how can we work with educators and policymakers meaningfully to engage these young people in processes of rebuilding of society while respecting that skepticism of
Hmm.
modernity's broken promises?
Hmm. Yeah, it's such a hard question. I think uh, we do a lot of like intergenerational work within the collective. So in our collective, we have, let's say, people that are from like the 80s to the 20s. That is my daughter, that is four, that sometimes she's part of the collectives as well. Um, and I think one of the things, at least in the position that I am, is that we need to recognize that they are right, to mistrust us. That what we are delivering today, the sort of promises that I feel my generation received and the sort of promises they are receiving are much different. So we did fail to them. And then we go back to this question of uh, how do we want to insist on doing the same things that didn't work and ask them to trust us? So I think part of the trust needs to be built from uh, sort of like establishing our responsibility and our accountability in harm. I think we need to start this conversation from that. Like we made a lot of mistakes. Hopefully we learn to with these mistakes, and this is what we can offer you so you don't repeat the same mistakes and you try to um, do new mistakes because it will be really hard to get it right. And we are not sure if there will be this right. And sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I think that all we can offer is like a good death, in a way that it's not like this sort of oppressive, violent structures that are being sort of nourished nowadays. So I think it's not um, what we can teach them that we did right, but it's rather what we did wrong. And I think there is a lot to do with trying to become good elders in this sense, not offer like the knowledge, but the guidance to deeply relating to show the mistakes that we have been making for generations in order that maybe, and we talk a lot about it's an intergenerational issue because even if we are getting everything absolutely right now. Let's imagine that we just change, like, and tomorrow we are doing everything that we need to have like a society with more social justice and to avoid ecological collapse. I don't think we can finish this work in this generation. So we're gonna need the trust of the next 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. I don't know, to do something differently.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of it has to do with rebuilding trust.
Hmm.
Diana, you had another question?
Yes, I think you mentioned a lot of it already, Dino, but I was thinking if you could maybe give some practical advice for schools. What can they do in order to educate students that they become responsible, thoughtful, and also respectful? I mean, you mentioned also some examples before, but maybe in a very summarized way or concrete tips.
Hmm.
And also, my second question related to this is because I think this is also a mindset of education we have, which is very, very strong. And you called it
Hmm.
mastery education in your
Hmm.
presentation. But this, what can we do in order to shift our mindset of education towards other approaches like the one you mentioned?
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, this is a super hard question. Um, I don't know because I mean it goes back to the problem that like when we have such structural problems, the kind of change that may be needed is a change that is like on much more deeper level. But I think one of the things that I can say is that we're gonna need like a multiplicity of like many different uh, solutions and possibilities, and they will have to be locally based, and they'll have to be inspired by like different cultures and different ontologies and different ways of knowing. So how do we open space for that? So we don't have like this sort of monoculture of knowledge and monoculture of understanding what an educational system is. So that's why again we try to do a lot of the undoing the harms, because the educational system also produces a lot of harm, and we have to be able to deal with this harm. So for example, I have been an anthropologist in another life, and part of like the issues of colonization and the violence that indigenous people suffered was sort of validated by the academia. And in the same way, schools sometimes teach students not to be what their culture is, but what the mainstream culture wants them to be. And I think we have to address these problems. But I also think there is a lot to do with, again, relationships. And there are a lot of great educators around the world that knows how to do that, right? So I think it's also this challenge of the things that work on the personal level quite well, and then when we go to the structures of it gets even harder. I don't know if I answered this question. I tried not to be honest, because
Yes,
I
yes,
didn't
I
want
think
to bring like this sort of, okay, so this is like the steps that we should take, because
no,
we
I
cannot
do.
claim that we have
This
them.
is, we cannot. You might also have your perspective, and you will not be able to, but to listen to your perspective on this. This was important to me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm guessing there's no other questions, so I guess we'll close out. I wanted to say thank you very much, Dino. I
Hmm.
think it was a
Thank
very
you.
inspiring discussion, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot different than other presentations we've had. So thank you for joining us
Hmm.
today and for giving that presentation. And then I just wanted to make a note that our next democracy talk is on the 12th of March, and it's with Timothy Murphy, as you can see, on pedagogical thoughtfulness for democracy. Dino, if you would like to join, please let us know and just participate in the conversation. You're welcome to. So yes, we look forward to seeing you all in a month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye
Thank you
bye.
very much.